to reform the monetary system, but was not given the opportunity to do so. The 1880s marked a time of economic growth fueled by the now booming railroad industry. The boom was primarily created by the overextension of bank financing, which would eventually lead towards yet another engineered economic bust. The bankers had played the same game that they had played with the money supply yet again by creating a boom which culminated in a bust with the Panic of 1893. In fact, the American Bankers Association would issue another circular on March 11, 1893, discouraging a return to free silver and encouraging their members to intentionally make money scarce. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, the issue of bimetallism and free silver versus the gold standard would dominate the U.S. political arena. In 1890, President Benjamin Harrison approved the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which authorized the U.S. Treasury to purchase an additional 4.5 million ounces of silver bullion every month. This was in response to the demands of miners and farmers who advocated a return to pre-1873 silver policies. Although not a true return to those policies, the Treasury was allowed to buy silver with notes that could be redeemed for either silver or gold. Unfortunately, with the gold standard still in effect, and European financiers only accepting gold for payment, people sought to convert their silver into gold, which began to deplete the nation's gold reserves. Amazingly, wealthy bankers such as J.P. Morgan and others would successfully blame the Sherman Silver Purchase Act for the Panic of 1893. This is despite the fact that the bankers' intentional contraction of the money supply spawned the crisis. This would lead to President Grover Cleveland calling a special session of Congress to approve legislation repealing the act, which he would eventually sign. Unfortunately for Cleveland, gold was still flowing out of the Treasury and was in danger of running out. In 1895, during the midst of the economic crisis spawning from the panic 2 years earlier, Cleveland saw no other option and approached J.P. Morgan for help to resupply gold to the Treasury. Morgan, seeing an opportunity for profit, offered to buy U.S. bonds in exchange for a large sum of European gold. Cleveland agreed, which replenished the Treasury with gold, while also netting Morgan substantial profits. The public was outraged, seeing this as another example of Wall Street and the government working together against the best interests of the people. This alone helped catapult the issue of silver and its role in monetary policy into the most hotly debated topic on the minds of the American people. The debate over silver set the stage for the 1896 presidential election between Republican William McKinley and Democrat William Jennings Bryan. McKinley favored a strict gold standard and was backed by rich industrialists. Bryan favored the return to bimetallism and free silver policies. Bryan would secure his party nomination by delivering one of the most well-known political speeches ever delivered before a political convention, entitled Crown of Thorns, Cross of Gold. In this speech, Bryan passionately advocated for the full remonetization of silver. Despite his efforts, Bryan would lose in a close race to McKinley, but his stance on the silver issue stalled the bankers' attempts to centralize their power for several decades. In 1900, Bryan would challenge McKinley for a second time, but would lose again. McKinley had again run on a pro-gold standard platform, and shortly after winning a second term, would sign into law the Gold Standard Act, which ended the exchange of gold for silver. This effectively ended the final remaining links of bimetallism. With the gold standard fully entrenched, the Rothschild family, alongside their European and American agents, were set to make a move to install a central bank in the United States. Throughout the 19th century, we have seen how major U.S. financial panics were engineered as a result of bankers manipulating the supply of money. The bankers decided that one final economic panic would be needed to gain the support necessary for the passage of legislation authorizing a new central bank. J.P. Morgan, who had now become the prominent Rothschild operative in America, would play a central role. Jacob Schiff, another key Rothschild associate, would also be involved. Schiff's family had maintained close ties to the Rothschild family since the 1700s by sharing a Frankfurt, Germany house with the Rothschilds known as the Green Shield. Schiff would use Rothschild money to vastly expand the power and influence of the American banking house Kuhn Loeb Company, an investment bank founded by Abraham Kuhn and Solomon Loeb. Kuhn Loeb Company was the principal financier behind E.H. Harriman and his American railroad empire. In combination with the Rothschild-owned National City Bank of Cleveland, they would become the main financial backers of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust. The partners of Kuhn Loeb Company also held close ties to the partners of other powerful firms through blood and marriage, such as Goldman Sachs and Company and Lehman Brothers. While the Rothschilds and their agents were working to set the conditions necessary to bring back a central bank in the United States, they had also been busy funding the pillaging of Africa for resources and trying to figure out a way to overthrow the ruling Russian Romanov family. Even though the Rothschild family had gained a tremendous amount of control over Europe through their banking businesses, they sought more. Nathan Rothschild's son Lionel Rothschild would take control of N.M. Rothschild & Sons, the London branch of the Rothschild's family business, following his father's death. He would invest heavily in European railroads, resource and mineral companies like Rio Tinto, and in 1875 would even help the British government purchase controlling interest in the Suez Canal. Lionel would pass away in 1879, leaving the business to his son Nathan Mayer Rothschild II. In the early 1880s, the British attempted to annex two independent Boer republics called the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, otherwise known as the Transvaal Republic, which are founded primarily by Dutch settlers. Their first attempt failed following a decisive military victory by Boer resistance leader Paul Kruger. Kruger would later be elected president of the Transvaal and negotiated a peace deal with the British. Although Kruger managed to establish independence for the Boer republics, it would be short-lived. Vast discoveries of gold and diamonds had been made throughout South Africa, which enticed many foreigners called outlanders to travel to this land. It would also entice the Rothschild-controlled British military to return several years later, which would eventually result in the Second Boer War. The war was primarily engineered by Rothschild agent Lord Alfred Milner, who in 1897 had ascended to the position of High Commissioner for Southern Africa and Governor of Cape Colony in the British imperial hierarchy. Milner would be responsible for the creation of the Milner Roundtable Group, which received partial funding from the Rothschild family. The group was founded by Milner and many of his close associates to act as an authority on British imperial interest. Most historians consider the group's official founding to have taken place in 1909, but others believe its origins can be traced back even earlier to the 1880s, a topic of which we will explore later. The group would be the inspiration for the Roundtable Quarterly, a magazine that would serve as a propaganda mechanism actively promoting British imperialism. The Roundtable Group would become one of the precursors to the establishment of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations, two groups that would actively promote the idea of global government. Milner would also be responsible for training a group of young men called Milner's Kindergarten. Many members of this group would become key figures in the British imperial hierarchy. One of these men, Lionel Curtis, would later become the principal founder of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which exists today as the Chatham House. Although the British people as a whole desired peace, Milner saw war as desirable. Milner made the claim that Kruger was denying freedom to the Outlanders by denying them voting rights. This gave Milner the pretext to claim that any war would be used to secure freedom for British subjects residing in these lands. In the peace conference prior to the war, Milner intentionally made demands of Kruger that he knew would not be accepted. These demands included giving foreigners voting rights and that all laws passed by the Transvaal Parliament must be approved by the British Parliament. Had Kruger agreed, the Transvaal would again be under the control of the British. Kruger would not agree to the terms, which finally gave Milner the right pretext to start the Second Boer War. In 1899, hundreds of thousands of British soldiers would do battle against the irregular forces of the Boers, which primarily consisted of farmers with rifles. Despite being outnumbered by an almost 10-to-1 margin, the Boers would fend off British attacks for 3 years before suffering defeat. As diabolical as Milner's actions were, he also believed that the British were a superior race and employed a policy of genocide against the Boers. Boers who attempted to surrender were executed. In addition, the use of concentration camps would be introduced to the modern world in this conflict. Under Milner's direction, anyone including women and children who were thought to be sympathetic to the Boers were taken to these camps where thousands would die. The concentration camp concept would later be used by the Nazis in World War II Germany and in Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution. By 1902, the Second Boer War was over, and Milner would oversee the full annexation of the Boer republics into the British Empire. Another instrumental figure in the British pillaging of South Africa was Cecil Rhodes, another Rothschild agent who would attempt to annex the Boer republics prior to Milner's engineered war. Rhodes was an Oxford-educated Freemason and staunch supporter of British imperialism. Rhodes was one of the founders of the De Beers Mining Company, which received funding from both the London Rothschild banking branch of N.M. Rothschild & Sons and the French Rothschild banking branch of de Rothschild Ferris. The funding allowed Rhodes to become rich off of the South African diamond trade. Prior to the outbreak of the Second Boer War, Rhodes would use his wealth to enter public life, becoming a member of the Cape Parliament and eventually Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Rhodes would implement laws favorable to mine and industry owners, and even had black people removed from their native lands. In 1895, Rhodes would attempt to overthrow the Transvaal government through what would become known as the Jameson Raid. Rhodes had hoped the raid would rally the Outlanders to overthrow Kruger's government, but it ended in failure. The scandal forced him to resign as Prime Minister and nearly resulted in the execution of his brother, who had been captured in the attempted raid. Despite the setback, Rhodes was such an influential figure that the entire area now known today as Zimbabwe was at one time named Rhodesia in his honor. Rhodes shared Milner's ideology that the British were a superior race. In his first will, Rhodes stated that he wanted to create a secret society that would bring the whole world under British rule. Although not explicitly mentioned in his last will and testament, he would leave his entire fortune to the Rhodes Trust, which would be used to help continue the Rothschild agenda. Following his death in 1902, the Rhodes estate would be administered by Leopold de Rothschild, the third son of Lionel de Rothschild, who had entered the family business working at N.M. Rothschild & Sons. It may seem strange that a Rothschild would be responsible for administrating his trust, but Rhodes had never married and was even believed by some historians to be a closet homosexual. Through Rothschild's administration, the Rhodes Scholarship was created to serve as a recruiting mechanism to find young men who would serve the agenda of the Rothschilds by providing them with a free education through Oxford. Carroll Quigley, in his book Tragedy and Hope, states that Rhodes' proposed secret society, known as the Society of the Elect, not only became a reality, but was tied directly in with the Milner Roundtable Group. Rhodes had envisioned a secret society, modeled after the Jesuits, in which he would serve as the general of the society, with an executive committee called the Junta of Three, and an inner circle of members called the Circle of Initiates, comprising the highest levels of the society. The rest of the group would be known as the Association of Helpers. According to Quigley, the society's origins can be traced back to 1881, but the group itself was formally established in 1891, and that the Association of Helpers was organized by Milner as the Roundtable Group itself. The Rothschilds also directed their energies toward overthrowing the Romanov family, who had ruled over Russia since the 1600s. The Russian czars, which ruled during the 1800s, refused to allow the creation of a privately run central bank in Russia. With this in mind, it is interesting to note that most of the czars that reigned during this time would either be assassinated or die suspiciously. Alexander I and Nicholas I both died prematurely and were believed to have been poisoned. Alexander II, who threw his full support behind Abraham Lincoln and the Union during the American Civil War and eliminated slavery in Russia, would fall victim to an assassination attempt in 1881. It was widely believed that the assassination, which had been carried out by an organization known as the People's Will, had actually been the result of a Jewish-led conspiracy that linked straight back to the Rothschild family. In 1882, the new Tsar Alexander III would implement anti-Jewish regulations called the May Laws as retribution for his father's death. Restrictions were placed on what occupations Jews could obtain, on what land Jews were allowed to live on, and even quotas were placed on the number of Jews that were allowed to attend schools and universities. During his reign, Alexander III would survive a train crash and be the subject of an assassination plot by the same organization that killed his father. The plot would ultimately fail, and the conspirators were sentenced to death. One of the conspirators was Alexander Ulyanov, the brother to Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, a man who would later be known as Vladimir Lenin. Lenin would later play a key role in the Bolshevik Revolution and the final overthrow of the Romanov family. Following Alexander III's death in 1894, his son Nicholas II would succeed him as the final Romanov to rule as Russian Tsar. In 1904, the firm of Kuhn-Loeb Company, led by Rothschild agent Jacob Schiff, would loan a vast sum of money to Japan as part of an effort to fund a war against Russia. The war began when the Japanese initiated a surprise attack against the Russian fleet in Port Arthur without a formal declaration of war. During this time frame, Nicholas II's administration would arrange the publication of anti-Jewish material accusing the Jews of being a fifth column in the conflict. This was actually not far from the truth, considering the large sums of money that Schiff was providing to the Japanese, which funded their war effort. The Russians would suffer from various logistical problems during the war, as the transport of supplies and troops over the one-way 6,000-mile Trans-Siberian Railway proved difficult. This eventually led to the fall of Port Arthur to the Japanese, and by mid-1905, Nicholas II accepted mediation from the U.S., which resulted in peace talks, and eventually the Treaty of Portsmouth, which officially ended the conflict. U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt would eventually earn a Nobel Peace Prize for his mediation efforts. Moving back to the U.S., the Rothschilds and their banking associates were set to make a final move to take over the nation's monetary system through a new privately run central bank. By the early 1900s, powerful corporations such as the Rockefellers, Standard Oil Trust, and others had dominated industry. Had it not been for the engineered scarcity of money in the latter part of the 19th century, these powerful corporations would likely not have emerged. President Theodore Roosevelt was thought to have dissolved these trusts via the Sherman Antitrust Act, but that wasn't actually the case. The powerful money trust of bankers was never broken up and would have their power consolidated further following the Panic of 1907. The Standard Oil Trust, which was divided into several corporations by Roosevelt, was actually all still controlled by Rockefeller. It was all a sham designed to make the people believe that the government had dissolved these powerful institutions, when in fact they had done very little to achieve this goal. Jacob Schiff would even state in the early part of 1907 that a major financial crisis would occur if the U.S. did not establish a central bank. The man at the center of the Panic of 1907 would be none other than J.P. Morgan, a Rothschild agent who is now the most powerful banker in the United States. After helping the U.S. government replenish the Treasury supply of gold following the Panic of 1893, he would become a principal figure in many business deals, including the mergers that resulted in the formation of General Electric, as well as the U.S. Steel Corporation through a business deal with Andrew Carnegie. He would even fund the work of famed scientist Nikola Tesla, but would cut off funds after discovering that Tesla's work would potentially give people a free, unlimited source of energy. Free energy, although great for the benefit of mankind, would not be profitable for a man like Morgan that created money out of nothing. Most school textbooks state that Morgan was the hero of the Panic of 1907 and saved the country from financial disaster by providing banks with enough capital to stave off a complete economic collapse. In actuality, Morgan and his Wall Street friends engineered the event to consolidate wealth and push competitors out of business. The collapse was caused by banks excessively loaning money to stock market speculators. Following a failed attempt in October of 1907 to corner the stock of the United Copper Company, the banks that had loaned money to facilitate the scheme would be overwhelmed by depositors demanding their money as rumors abounded on Wall Street. This would lead to the eventual collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest trusts in New York City. People soon became fearful that the banking system was not solvent, resulting in a large number of bank runs across the country and a crash in the general stock market. Many banks would not survive the crisis. Morgan combined with George F. Baker, the president of First National Bank, James Stillman of the Rothschild-owned National City Bank of New York, and the U.S. Secretary of Treasury George B. Cortelyou determined which institutions would go bankrupt and which ones they would prop up through loans. The loans were based off of the fractional reserve banking concept and was money that Morgan and his associates created out of nothing. The men decided to prop up Trust Company of America after an audit indicated that it was financially sound, but refused to bail out Knickerbocker. John D. Rockefeller would deposit $10 million in National City Bank, and Cortelyou would deposit millions into several New York banks with funds from the U.S. Treasury. Still, the banks would not make short-term loans that were used to facilitate daily stock trades, which resulted in a continuing slide in the stock market. Morgan would eventually convince other New York City banks to pledge millions of dollars to prop up the stock market. Morgan would also successfully absorb the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company into the U.S. Steel Corporation in order to bail out a large brokerage firm which had borrowed heavily using Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company stock as collateral. Even though the acquisition would violate Roosevelt's supposed stance on trust and monopolies, the merger was approved, considering the potential for a severe market collapse if it was not. A total collapse was averted, and many hailed J.P. Morgan as a hero, including Nathan Mayer Rothschild II. Not everybody hailed Morgan as a hero. Representative Charles A. Lindbergh was one of the most vocal critics of the money trust during this time. He had the following to say about the causes of the Panic of 1907. The criticism of Morgan and the powerful banking elite spawned congressional investigations into the inner workings of the money trust and corporations associated with it. The Stanley Committee, which investigated the affairs of the U.S. Steel Corporation following the Panic of 1907, actually called the crisis artificial and designed for the benefit of the company itself. In addition, the Pujo Committee was formed to investigate Wall Street and the powerful money trust that had emerged following the Panic of 1907. Morgan and other powerful bankers would be called to testify in front of the committee. For Morgan, the appearances in front of the committee were stressful, and his associates would blame his death, which occurred shortly after, on the stress he faced by testifying. The committee would finally issue a majority report, stating that the money trust was abusing their power to consolidate control over industry. Unfortunately, the damaging report was not used to truly resolve the problem. Instead, it would later be used to sell the public on the phony solution of a new central bank. Shortly after the Panic of 1907, there was an immediate push to set up a central bank. Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island would play an instrumental role in this push. Aldrich was a powerful senator who had numerous connections to Wall Street moguls and big business. His daughter Abby Aldrich would eventually end up marrying oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller Jr. John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich would have 5 sons, including future Vice President Nelson Rockefeller and future Council on Foreign Relations head and chairman of Chase National Bank, David Rockefeller. In 1908, Aldrich helped gain passage of the Aldrich-Vreeland Act that was signed into law by President Teddy Roosevelt. This legislation in part authorized the formation of the National Monetary Commission to examine the central banking systems of Europe and issue a report on the findings. Aldrich himself would head the commission and spend nearly 2 years using taxpayer money, traveling Europe, consulting with the continent's central bankers, all on the taxpayer's dime. The reports from the commission would eventually become the basis for the creation of the Federal Reserve a few years later. Following Aldrich's return from Europe, a 10-day secret meeting in 1910, faked as a hunting trip, was arranged at Jekyll Island, a remote location off the coast of Georgia, between Aldrich and some of the most powerful banking interests in the country. The meeting was so secret that members were instructed to only address other members by their first names, so that servants would not learn of their true identities. Later, members of this group would be referred to as the First Name Club. The purpose of the meeting was to determine how to go about setting up a central bank in the United States, and more importantly, how it should be sold to the American people. The meeting itself was a conspiracy of powerful business interests that sought domination over the nation's financial system. One of the primary conspirators was a man by the name of Paul Warburg. Warburg had previously worked with his brother-in-law, Jacob Schiff at Kuhn Loeb Company, who, as we have shown, was a key Rothschild agent that helped to fund the railroad empire of E.H. Harriman. Schiff and Warburg, like J.P. Morgan, were all agents for the Rothschild family. Warburg would play a key role at Jekyll Island in helping to formulate the plan for a new central bank. Other conspirators included representatives of J.P. Morgan, including Henry P. Davison, senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company, Benjamin Strong, a top lieutenant of J.P. Morgan, and Frank Vanderlip, the president of the powerful National City Bank and former assistant treasury secretary in the McKinley administration. The American people historically did not trust the banking system, and were especially wary of it following the Panic of 1907. Legislation for a central bank would be rejected unless it was sold in a deceptive manner. As a result, it was decided at Jekyll Island that they would avoid using the term bank and instead call it the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System would be much like the old Second Bank of the United States. The bank would be privately owned, and it would control the credit of the entire nation. The only major difference is that it would not be called a bank. The conspirators believed that the name could be used to deceive the American people to think that it was not a central bank. The plan also called for a system of 12 regional banks whose actions would be coordinated by a national board of bankers to give people the illusion that it was a decentralized system. Shortly after the meeting, the plan devised at Jekyll Island would be introduced to the public. Called the Aldrich Plan, it was sold to the American people as a plan to stabilize the monetary system. The bankers would spend millions financing an educational campaign about the bill through a phony Wall Street funded group called the National Citizens League. The plan was sold to the American people as the end result of the National Monetary Commission, but in actuality was the plan that Aldrich, Warburg, and the other first-name club members decided upon at Jekyll Island. The Aldrich Plan was pushed heavily by the Republican Party as a key part of their platform. The plan immediately came under attack by opponents such as Representative Charles A. Lindbergh, who charged that the Aldrich Plan would make the money trust even more powerful. Opposition to the Aldrich Plan was fierce, and the bill would not be passed. In 1912, Republican President William Taft was a popular president and seemed to be a shoo-in for re-election. His Democrat opponent would be Woodrow Wilson, the sitting governor of New Jersey and a former president of Princeton University. Taft's re-election bid would be railroaded when former Republican President Theodore Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate under the Bull Moose Party. All three presidential campaigns were funded by powerful bankers, but the deck was stacked in favor of Wilson. The bankers knew that by financing Roosevelt's presidential campaign, that it would split the Republican Party and elect the Democrat Wilson. They also believed that it would be easier to pass a bill authorizing a central bank as a Democrat-led initiative instead of a Republican-led initiative, considering the opposition of the Aldrich bill. Wilson even made the campaign promise that he would not authorize a central bank if elected. Wilson would even gain the support of William Jennings Bryan, who was still a powerful figure in the Democrat Party, along with his populist supporters. With Roosevelt splitting the Republican Party vote, Wilson would be easily elected president. In 1913, Wilson would take office. Like the Republicans, the Democrats also had a monetary reform bill. The bill would eventually be called the Glass-Owen Act or the Federal Reserve Act and fulfilled all the major points of the Aldrich Plan. Despite the similarities, it was publicly sold as a radically different alternative to the Aldrich Plan. Aldrich himself would even publicly attack the Federal Reserve Act to create the illusion that he was against it while it was being debated upon. After months of debate, the House version of the Federal Reserve Act, called the Glass Bill, was passed 287 to 85 on September 19, 1913. On December 19, 1913, the Senate passed their version of the bill 54 to 34. There were still many differences that needed to be settled upon before a conference bill would be ready for consideration. With the annual Christmas recess, many senators and representatives had already left Washington, given the assurance that this matter would not be brought up until the next year. In one day, however, all disputes were resolved and quickly brought to a vote. On December 22, 1913, both the House and the Senate would pass the Glass-Owen Act, or the Federal Reserve Act, with many members absent. Despite having originally promised not to approve a new central bank, Wilson would immediately sign the bill into law. After all, Wilson was put into power by the same people who were behind both the Aldrich Bill and the Federal Reserve Act. He was also closely advised by Colonel Edward Mendell House, a man who, as we'll see later, was not only in favor of a new central bank, but also advocated the implementation of global government. Throughout this process, Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh was one of the most vocal members of Congress speaking out against this bill. Prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, Lindbergh said the following: In addition, the Federal Reserve Act is a clear violation of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states, Nowhere in the Constitution does it give Congress the power to relinquish these powers to a privately run central bank. In fact, previous central banks, like the First Bank of the United States and the Second Bank of the United States, were also unconstitutional. Essentially, the Federal Reserve Act gave the banking elite the authority to enslave the American people into a centrally controlled system of debt. Through the Federal Reserve Act, a privately run central bank was given the authority to create money out of nothing and lend this money that was created out of nothing to the government in exchange for bonds or debt. With this authority, as well as other monetary tools at their disposal, the Federal Reserve can literally create economic booms and busts by manipulating the supply of money. In order to increase the supply of money, the Federal Reserve simply buys government debt. In order to decrease the supply of money, the Federal Reserve reverses the process and sells government debt. The process of buying and selling government debt would be formalized years later in the 1930s with the implementation of the Federal Open Market Committee. This committee was placed in charge of the Federal Reserve's open market operations and to this day plays an instrumental role in various aspects of U.S. monetary policy. The Federal Reserve Act also required all nationally chartered banks to become member banks of the Federal Reserve System, which put them under the control of Fed policies. Based upon these policies, Federal Reserve member banks could also create money out of nothing based upon the amount of money they have in reserves and loan that money at interest. The reserve requirement for member banks is set by the Fed itself. Historically, the typical reserve requirement for a Federal Reserve member bank has been set at 10%. For example, let's assume a bank has $100 in total deposits. The bank is allowed to use